Summary of Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. A smart young woman from a middle-class English family named Gertrude meets a young miner named Mr. Morel at a country dance. Gertrude is religious and lives a simple life, but she likes Walter Morel's active personality and thinks he looks great when she sees him dance at the party. A few months later, they get married, and Mrs. Morel soon finds out she is pregnant. They have a happy first few months of marriage, but Mrs. Morel finds that she can't really talk to her husband and that they don't have much in common, even though they were attracted to each other at first. What she finds out is that Walter is not as rich as she thought and that they rent their house from Walter's mother instead of owning it. The other women in the mine town think she is snobby and above them, so she doesn't get along with them. When Mrs. Morel has a son, she names him William and loves him very much. Even though she and Mr. Morel are still friends, she is no longer interested in him, and things get worse between them after the baby is born. Mr. Morel cuts off all of William's hair one morning when Mrs. Morel comes downstairs. William is only a few months old. This makes Mrs. Morel very angry, and it makes things worse between her and her husband. She loves her son very much and enjoys making plans for his future and seeing him grow up. Jane is Mrs. Morel's second child, and then she finds out she's pregnant with her third. A fair comes to town one day, not long before Mrs. Morel's due date. She doesn't want to go, but William can't enjoy the fair without her, so she does. While she is there, Mrs. Morel sees that Mr. Morel, who has started drinking more often, is in the beer tent. It doesn't surprise her when he comes home that night drunk. The next few weeks, there is a public holiday, and Mr. Morel uses it to drink with his sexist friend Jerry Purdy. Mrs. Morel can't stand Jerry Purdy. They fight when Mr. Morel comes back that night because he is very drunk. In order to cool down, Mrs. Morel looks at the moon and the flowers in her yard after Mr. Morel locks her out of the house. When she comes back, Mr. Morel lets her in again but doesn't talk to her. Another boy is born to Mrs. Morel. Soon after the baby is born, she takes the kids out of the house to avoid Mr. Morel's rage and sits on a nearby hill to watch the sunset. That's when she decides to name the baby Paul. She feels bad about herself and sad as she looks down at the baby. She feels bad about the baby's look because she didn't want him while she was pregnant. After a while, Paul turns into a serious and thoughtful kid. William, on the other hand, is very busy and cute. Mrs. Morel has a third boy named Arthur, and Mr. Morel loves him right away. William gets a job as a clerk when he is old enough. He does very well and is liked by many people. A job offer comes his way in London, and he gladly takes it. Mrs. Morel is proud of William, but she is so sad that he has to leave home. At first, William sends money to his family and goes home a lot. But as time goes on, he gets caught up in city life and spends his money on Louisa Lily Dennis Western, the woman he is engaged to. William takes the young woman home to meet his family. They are let down when she treats them like slaves and acts like she is better than them. As their relationship goes on, William grows to hate his fiancée, but he still won't break up with her. When William is publicly mean to Louisa during another visit, Mrs. Morel is shocked and sad. Soon after, William gets pneumonia and dies, which breaks Mrs. Morel's heart. Paul, on the other hand, becomes a smart young man and gets a job as a clerk in Nottingham. He likes his job and gets along well with his co-workers, but the long hours are bad for his health. Mrs. Morel is still sad about William's death, and Paul, who is close to his mother, wants to pull her out of herself and get her attention again. When Paul gets pneumonia, Mrs. Morel sees how badly she has ignored him, which breaks her heart. She does everything she can to take care of him and get him better. If Paul gets better, Mrs. Morel will be devoted to him and put all her dreams for the future in him. After being sick, Paul has some time off work, so he starts going to a nearby farm that Mr. Livers owns. He becomes friendly with Miriam Livers, the daughter of the Livers. Miriam is shy, religious, and smart. Mrs. Morel doesn't like her and thinks she's bad for Paul. Even though Paul and Miriam get along fine, they don't look good together. The two of them are too young to understand that they are drawn to each other. Mrs. Morel keeps a close eye on their relationship and wants Paul to end it because she loves the time he spends with Miriam. After a while, Paul goes back to work at the plant, but this time his hours are shorter, so he has more time to paint, which is what he really loves. Right about this time, Miriam realizes she loves Paul, but she feels bad about it because it goes against her Christian beliefs. Miriam doesn't tell Paul how she feels. Miriam goes on vacation with her family to the beach. Paul does spend most of his time with Mrs. Morel, though, and only sees Miriam in the evenings. Around this time, Paul gets an award for his picture at an art show in Nottingham. One night, he meets Miriam and a young woman named Clara Dawes at the art show. Paul and Clara used to work together at the same workplace, but now they are no longer together. Paul thinks Clara is rude and a man-hater because she supports the suffragettes. He doesn't like Baxter either because he was mean to him on his first day at work. Even though Miriam and Paul are still dating, it's hard for them because they both want to be with each other but don't know how. Paul doesn't like Miriam because he thinks she is too spiritual, which makes it hard for him to be physically close to her or normal. Even though Miriam is upset and hurt, she keeps saying that she is good for Paul and that he belongs to her. Mrs. Morel gets sick one night while Paul is out with Miriam. Annie scolds Paul for ignoring his mother when he gets back. Paul tries to end his relationship with Miriam, but he still goes to the farm a lot because he is friends with Edgar, Miriam's brother. Paul is asked to have tea with Clara Dawes at Miriam's house one afternoon. Paul still doesn't like Clara, but he finds her impressive and beautiful. Soon after, Paul brings a package to Clara's house, which is close to the workplace where he works. They find out that she is very sad and lives with her mother, Mrs. Radford. Clara gets a job at the workplace thanks to Paul, but she is still rude and quiet there. He makes an effort to bother her because she makes him mad. In the summer, Paul and Miriam get engaged. But a few weeks later, Paul backs out of the deal. Even though he starts dating Clara, he still sees Miriam a lot. When Baxter Dawes learns about Paul and Clara, he and Paul get into a fight in a club. In the end, Baxter attacks Paul while he is going back from Clara's house at night. After this, Paul doesn't feel too badly hurt and has a strange connection to Baxter. During this time, Mrs. Morel's health starts to get worse. She gets sick while on vacation in Sheffield and stays with Annie. It turns out she has cancer. Paul can't stand the thought of his mother dying. In Sheffield, he stays to take care of her. While he is there, he learns that Baxter is getting better from typhoid there. Paul goes to see him, and the two of them become friends. Everyone knows that Mrs. Morel won't live for long after a few weeks, but she is able to go home. Paul still talks to Miriam and Clara, but he doesn't care about them as much as he used to because he is now spending all of his time taking care of his mother. Mrs. Morel's death is slow and painful, and Annie and Paul, who are taking care of her, are having a hard time. Last but not least, Paul poisons Mrs. Morel with the painkillers the doctor gave him when she gets too sick to bear. William and her are buried together, and Mr. Morel can't stand to live in the house he shared with her. He and Paul leave together and find different places to live in Nottingham. Not long after Mrs. Morel died, Paul takes Baxter on a trip to the beach and asks Clara to come along. Since his mother died, he has lost all interest in her and in life in general. He is so sad that he wants to end his own life. He sets things up so that he leaves them together in the cottage because he thinks Clara wants to make peace with Baxter. Paul lied to Clara, and she is mad at him for it. But she forgives Baxter and agrees to marry him again. Paul feels like he has nothing to do with life after this and wants to die. When he sees Miriam outside of church one night, he calls her over to his house. It makes Miriam sad to see how bad he has become, so she suggests that they get married. Miriam decides she will never see Paul again after he turns her down. Paul takes a car out into the country after she leaves and walks across the fields at night. To be with his mother, He calls out and wants to end his own life. Still, he doesn't want to die and knows he can't kill himself. Paul decides to keep going as he walks back across the dark fields toward the town.
About the author. David Herbert Lawrence was born in northern England in a coal town. Lawrence loved the country area near his home and spent a lot of time there as a child. After high school, he got a job as a clerk in a town office. But a few months later, he got asthma and had to quit his job. Lawrence spent a lot of time at a nearby farm while he was getting better. There, he met Jessie Chambers, who was the model for Miriam and Sons and Lovers. He went to school at Nottingham University and then got a job teaching at a London university. Chambers sent some of Lawrence's fiction to a literary magazine edited by the poet Ford Madox Ford, which got him noticed for his writing. Lawrence then decided to make writing his job. His first book, The White Peacock, came out in 1910, not long before his mother died. Lawrence was greatly affected by the death of his mother, which he used as inspiration for Sons and Lovers. Friederike Weekly, who was married, and Lawrence ran away together with her in 1912. They left Britain to travel around Europe. When they went back to England in 1913, they joined the literary and intellectual scene in London. When World War I broke out in Europe, Lawrence spoke out against it. People didn't like him because of this, and his book The Rainbow, which had sexual material and was banned in the UK, was accused of obscenity. His books Women in Love, 1920, and Lady Chatterley's Lover, 1928, were also banned because they were thought to be sexual. In the end, he left England and went to the United States in 1917. He died of TB in 1930.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.